Hello learners, my name is Arundita Bhanjdev and I work at Pradhan. Welcome to this video. In the previous videos, you heard about malnutrition, dietary patterns, and how to recognize nutritional deficiencies in our body. Today, we are going to talk about dietary diversity and indigenous knowledge. Let us see what do these two concepts mean separately and how can a relation between them lead to an improvement in nutrition and then in sustainable consumption. Before we start, let us see what are we going to cover in this video. We will start with looking at the global and national hunger and malnutrition figures and numbers. We will then understand the concept of dietary diversity and why it is important for us to understand it and then follow it. Then we will see what is indigenous or what we also call tribal knowledge on food and consumption and how can this knowledge improve dietary diversity. And finally, how can indigenous knowledge be helpful in the overall agenda of improving nutrition and sustainable consumption, especially for the rural tribal population. So, in 2016, the Food and Agriculture Organization or the FAO estimated that 10.7% of the global population was suffering from chronic undernourishment. Now, there have been improvements towards reducing hunger in the last few decades. However, malnutrition remains to be a crucial challenge in the developing world. Take, for instance, Asia. Asia has the highest number of undernourished people. And undernourishment in South Asia, where we all live, has increased from 9.4% in the year 2015 to 11.5% in 2016, around 2% in just 1 year. The Global Hunger Index, which is calculated on the basis of total undernourishment of the population, child mortality, child stunting and wasting, places India at the 94th spot among 107 countries. And this index categorizes the country's hunger level at serious. So, to improve the alarming figures of poverty, hunger and malnutrition, the United Nations or the UN launched the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in the year 2015. That is, by 2030, the whole world would have achieved many important indicators of sustainable development. However, 5 years after setting the goal, in 2020, the UN reported that we are still off the mark to achieve this goal. So what is the challenge? So there are many factors that obstruct the fulfillment of the goal to end hunger, food insecurity and malnutrition, such as economic crisis, climate change, even political unrest, and as we all know more recently, COVID-19 induced pandemic. Now, another thing is, many food security and nutrition challenges are complex problems. Now, we spoke about development challenges being complex in Unit 3. What makes food and nutrition security, the problem of food and nutrition security complex is that they are a result of coming together of many other challenges faced by people, such as poverty, discrimination, a lack of access, etc. Food security is described in detail in one of the earlier videos by Professor Nitya Rao in Unit 5. If you recall, food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, economic and social access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences. So, food security is not only about reducing hunger, but beyond hunger, there are many interconnected dimensions like availability, access, quality, utilization, and stability that determine food and nutrition security. Now, ignoring such interconnected dimensions really can impact how we understand and the challenges of food and nutrition security. In this video, we will try to focus on all of these dimensions. Now, we'll come back to this. First, let us see what is dietary diversity. Dietary diversity, or in other words, diversity in diet, is defined as the number of different types of food that we eat over a given period of time, and mostly over a day. The number of different types of food that a household eats reflects the household's access to a variety of food and the household's access to nutrition. In Unit 5 again, you saw the description on the different types of access to food. Access such as physical access, social access, and economic access. To understand dietary diversity better, it is important to explore the concept of food groups. Now, what are food groups? We know that foods vary between countries and even between different regions in the same country. Food consumption surveys from different countries covering different age and sex population groups have led to a nutrition-sensitive classification of food all the food that we all eat into 12 food groups by the FAO and the World Health Organization, or the WHO. Now, each of these groups contain multiple food which are similar across geographies, while some are unique to the local areas. There are other groupings used by other studies and organizations to measure dietary diversity. Now, this table provides a list of the 12 food groups that I was just talking about. These food groups reflect a variety of food groups and nutrients within each food group. So, dietary diversity can be measured either of a household or of an individual. Like, we can measure how diverse your diet is or how diverse your household's diet is. And there's a score which dietary diversity is calculated on the basis of. So, our scores will be high if we eat, say, 5 or more of these food groups in a day. 3 or less than 3 will give us a low score, and that would mean that it represents low levels of nutrition. Now you can see a picture of a plate which is, high in diversity, and it contains almost all the food groups. A study found that on an average, Indian households consumes 6 out of these 12 food groups. The number of food groups that an individual or household is consuming is based on several factors, such as availability, access to that kind of food, and even affordability, whether we are able to afford that food or not. The 3 dimensions of food security we discussed just some time ago, this covers that. Whether all food items are available locally, whether households can access the food, go to the market, or they have the money to buy it. So now, why is it important for us to understand dietary diversity? So there's a strong correlation between the food insecurity experienced by people and the diversity in their diets. Studies show that people who are food insecure often find themselves unable to arrange or access food, and then are forced to compromise on the nutrition quality or even quantity of food that they consume. And the second point is, dietary diversity is especially important amongst populations whose diets are based on staples. What do we mean by staples? Rice, wheat, etc. These staples fill your stomach, but they are micronutrient deficient. So then, moving on to the next section of our video, let us see indigenous knowledge and its relation to dietary diversity. Indigenous or tribal people are found in many parts of India, and they are known to possess and retain knowledge of the land and food resources. Knowledge that is rooted in historical continuity, or that is passed on to them from their forefathers who have been living in the same land for ages. Indigenous foods are those foods that are locally available in the forest and around where these tribal people live. These food items are known to have high nutritive value as compared to other varieties of food. And majority of the tribal population in India are known to reside in these rich biodiverse lands, lands which are rich in these different kinds of food resources. Now, here are some pictures of locally available food items from Santhal regions of Chakai, which is in Jammu district of Bihar. You can see these pictures include local fishes, local fruits, vegetables, various kinds of pulses, grains, such as millets. Some of us may have seen some of these foods. Many of us wouldn't even know that these kind of food exist. Let us pause here and reflect on 2 points. Now, studies have reported that a high prevalence of undernutrition, chronic energy deficiency, and anemia is prevalent in tribal adults and children. But let's ask ourselves, why do tribal populations who often live near such biodiversity have access to rich food, have low levels of nutrition? What could be the reasons? Now, let us look at some possible reasons. Current government policies in India focus on a universal model of agriculture. That means only focusing on growing specific kinds of crops. This leaves little or no choice for rural and vulnerable communities to decide what crops to grow. Imagine you are in a situation where you are a farmer and you can't decide what to grow. Now, another reason is that what to produce is largely determined by what is suitable to the markets, what attracts the customers, are usually packed foods, fast foods, and that is what is pushed for production. Thirdly, the indigenous food obtained locally from the natural environment through farming and wild harvesting of which we also call foraging, are largely untapped in the Indian context. There's little or no evidence about household access to indigenous food and their importance in achieving food and nutrition security. Access to food, especially for the rural and tribal population, is usually understood by relating it with livelihoods and income. What does that mean? That means that higher the income, it would automatically mean that our nutrition becomes higher. But this ignores the potential of local consumption and production. Now, lastly, there is a lack of awareness, not only in non-tribal communities, but also in the younger generation of tribal communities about the importance of traditional knowledge on food and nutrition. I'll give you an example. Pradhan, an NGO working with the tribal communities in Eastern India, found that tribal people, especially the youth of the community, do not want to consume their own traditional local food and tend to devalue their own rich, diverse food systems, which include varieties of rice, millets, pulses, roots and tubers, green leafy vegetables, and local fruits that we just saw in the pictures. So what is the reason for that? A lack of awareness and information plus a market-centric approach to production has given rise to a stigma or a shame amidst these youth in the communities, where these foods are usually referred to as jungli, which is often used not in a very respectable sense. So what is the way forward towards sustainable consumption and in improving food and nutrition security of rural and tribal population? The first is that we as change makers need to engage with the policy and recognize the value of indigenous knowledge and practices around food and consumption, and really think about how can they be used to improve nutrition levels. The second is that the potential of local production and consumption should be explored, and that should be brought into the food systems. The third is that tapping the potential of indigenous foods and how it can help in diversifying our diets, especially of the rural people where these kind of indigenous food is available locally. That needs to be tapped. The fourth is that documentation and quantitative consumption estimates, which is lacking of the actual intake of these foods and how it actually enhances nutrition, needs to be brought into practice and policy. And finally, as we spoke about the youth and the indigenous community and their awareness level, there is a need to facilitate indigenous communities to participate in decision making at all stages of the food system, so that they are able to grow culturally appropriate and locally determined food. This will also help them to sustain the traditional knowledge that they have been possessing since in generations, and to also address the stigma and shame. Now, let us sum up our video. In the context of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we need to explore ways to increase consumption of local foods or indigenous food to make the food system really fight external shocks that we just discussed, like economic crisis, political unrest, and even COVID. Second is there's need to promote diversified and nutrition-focused production patterns in the form of government policies and interventions for promoting a healthy diet. The third is we need to leverage this biodiversity to also improve access, utilization, availability, and affordability of a nutritious and diverse diet. This, my dear learners, if you would remember, was the definition of food security that we just discussed in the beginning of the video and which we also saw in Unit 5. So we have kind of covered the various dimensions of food security and stressed on how that can be looked at from an indigenous foods perspective. And finally, conserving biodiversity and indigenous knowledge through systematic policy interventions and documentations to create evidence both for the community and for the larger scientific and health community is very important for sustainable development. Now, I also have 3 exercises for you to think about. How many food groups do you and the people in your household consume? Think about it. Find out about some indigenous and local consumption practices where you are or where you live or where you work. And also, can you think of ways in which you can raise awareness around the various types of local and indigenous consumption patterns? Now, these are some references and suggested readings which you'll also find in the chapter. And here are our partners. Thank you so much.